Okay, so this week's concept is the notion of political economy, which basically answers, at its core, answers the question, how involved is the government in the economy? How involved is the government in people's daily economic transactions, in businesses? How involved is the government in the promotion of economic growth? And in what ways is the government involved in the economy? Okay, and we'll talk about the ways the government is involved in the economy in the next slide. So basically, that's what it boils down to. How involved, to what extent, heavily involved, minimally involved, or somewhere in between, is the government in the economy. Okay, so that's basically what we're talking about here. A heavy role of the state versus a small role of the state, or somewhere in between. Which leads us to the three main types of political economies. You have the market economy on one end of this scale, which basically means that the economy is left essentially to its own devices, okay? Where wages are determined by the supply and demand of jobs, of laborers. The government takes a minimal role in the economy. The government does other things like providing security, a police force, a military, minimally involved in trade relations abroad and things like that. So the role of the government is fairly minimal in a market economy. On the other end of the spectrum is a command economy. And the command economy basically is a situation where the state or the government essentially owns all factors of production. In other words, it owns land, labor, and capital. Okay, determining people's wages, determining what gets produced, how much gets produced. It's very much what's called a planned economy, planned essentially by the government. And I'll give you examples of this in the next slide. Then, somewhere in the middle is a mixed economy, which essentially are most countries around the world, where you see, the government playing a pretty, I wouldn't say significant, but a pretty sizable role in making sure that economies are running smoothly, that they are stable, that people are getting the goods, the economic goods that they need in order to survive. In other words, a decent wage, and other things that are necessary for the economy to move smoothly, and for businesses in the economy to be making profit so that they can reinvest money, so that they can expand their businesses, so that they can hire more workers, and so on and so forth. Okay, labor and things like that as well for workers, having some regulation of the economy, so it doesn't suffer too much if there is an economic recession or a depression. Regulating the emergence of monopolies in economies, so making sure that sort of thing doesn't happen. So again, the mixed economy is this notion that the government plays a role, but is not as heavy-handed as total control of the economy in the command economy, or the laissez-faire, or the market determines everything through supply and demand, where the government pretty much doesn't do anything in a market economy. So again, most countries fall somewhere in the middle between these two extremes. Okay, so what does this look like in the real world? So if we think about just the 20th century, we can think of these four different examples, four categories of the role of the state or the role of the government in economic growth and development. The first one I already mentioned, which is the command economy. In other words, those countries in the 20th century during the 1900s where essentially the government had a planned economy, where the government owned all factors of production, and there was very little that the market, businesses and laborers, could do in terms of their own freedom to pursue economic transactions. The classic examples of command economies are communist regimes of the Soviet Union, of Cuba, China. During the bulk of the 1900s, those, not the bulk, but especially since World War II, around that time, those countries had what would be called command economies. The two middle roles were roles pursued by the developing world. So we're talking about Latin America and Asia, and to a lesser extent, Africa. The first one, what's called import substitution and industrialization. I don't want to get into the details, precisely what it is, but essentially what happened in Latin American countries, such as Brazil, Mexico, Argentina, Chile, the larger countries, especially some of the smaller countries as well, but mostly the larger countries in Latin America. Basically, the state played a sizable role in attempting to industrialize the country. Essentially what the state or the governments did in this situation was to not own all factors of production, but the state identified strategic industries and nationalized them. One of the most important ones was oil production, but also telecommunications was also something. Some other areas include the provision of electricity, were all done by the state. So strategic sectors of the economy were actually owned by the state. So not the entire set of businesses, but only strategic areas of the economy were born. Copper production in Chile, for example, was not done by private industry, but it was owned by the state. So the state actually owned these businesses, these strategic sectors of the economy. Okay. In addition to owning businesses or owning these strategic sectors, public ownership of them, the state also established what were called protectionism. In other words, to shield domestic industries, private domestic industries, against foreign competition, they would establish high rates of tariffs. So things that would be coming into the country to compete against domestic products produced domestically would be very heavily tariffed, so much more expensive to allow the domestic market, the domestic production, to compete more effectively against foreign products. In addition, the state played a key role in promoting economic growth or promoting industrialization by providing subsidies, easy credit to some of these private corporations, private domestic corporations, to get them off the ground, so to speak. So the state played a key role in developing this. And one of the key aspects of import substitution industrialization was that what was being produced by these industries was for domestic consumption, okay, for the domestic market. So what was produced in Brazil was for Brazilians. What was produced in Mexico was for Mexicans, okay? This is important because it distinguishes it from the export-led development model, which was pursued by a lot of the Asian countries, including China, South Korea, Singapore, Taiwan, where the idea was very similar to import substitution industrialization. But the key difference was in terms of this heavy role of the state in promoting industrialization, in promoting industries like the computer industry, for example, or the automobile industry, or the industry, related to microwaves, televisions, refrigerators. I mean, those were intended for the for trade abroad, to export these goods, so the state was less interested in promoting industrialization for a domestic market, but it really was about promoting economic growth, economic development through the export of these goods that began to be supported in a variety of ways by the governments of Singapore, of South Korea, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, but again, these two models saw a heavy role of the state, okay, but certainly not as heavy-handed as the economy. But certainly more than the fourth category, which is market-based economies, okay? And basically, these are the economies of the industrial world. We're looking at Japan, Canada, Australia, the United States, so on and so forth, where we see some regulation of the economy through a variety of mechanisms, but certainly nothing to the extent that we see in import substitution industrialization or export-led growth. We do see this category of democratic socialism within the category of market-based economies, where democratic socialism envisioned a more robust role of the state in terms of the promotion of, in particular, social welfare, but also in terms of regulating the economy. If you recall, when I talked about neo-corporatism last week, the role of the state in establishing peak associations of interest groups, and then fostering the cooperation between these peak associations and businesses and the government. That's one way that we're talking about the state taking a leading role here. Not as much as in ISI or export-led growth, but certainly more than what we see happening in, for example, especially the United States, which is a much more market-based economy than most countries in that particular category.